She slid the divorce papers across the table and smirked. "It is just a prank," she said. I did not argue or beg. I simply picked up the pen and signed every page. Watching her face turn pale, she did not know I had already found her hidden phone, read the calculated messages, and spotted the fatal flaw in her documents. My signature was not a surrender. It was the moment the trap changed hands. My name is Harper James, for 8 years of marriage, and a total of 11 years of sharing a life. I believed the heavy oak doors of our Chestnut Hill brownstone locked the chaos of the world firmly outside. This house, with its intricate crown molding, the dark mahogany wainscoting, and the original hardwood floors that groaned softly underfoot, was my absolute sanctuary. It was a fortress of quiet predictability in a city that never stopped moving. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet celebration of that sanctuary. It was the evening of our 8th wedding anniversary. The dining room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of 12 taper candles. I had spent 2 hours roasting a chicken with rosemary and lemon. The rich, savory scent filling the high-ceilinged room and masking the faint smell of old dust that always lingered in these historic homes. Across the long mahogany table sat my wife, Sloane Mercer. She was dressed impeccably, almost severely, in a midnight blue silk blouse that draped flawlessly over her sharp shoulders. Not a single strand of her ash-blonde hair dared to fall out of its styled placement. Her makeup was meticulously applied, catching the candlelight in a way that felt less like an intimate evening at home and far more like a carefully lit magazine photo shoot for her high-end interior design studio. She spoke in a voice that was too soft, too measured, and entirely devoid of the sharp edges I had fallen in love with a decade ago. "The wine is absolutely lovely, Harper," she said, her tone carrying an airy, breathy quality that felt entirely rehearsed, like an actor reading the opening lines of a play she did not particularly enjoy. "It is the Pinot Noir we bought in Oregon 3 years ago," I replied casually, watching her swirl the dark red liquid in her heavy crystal glass. I thought tonight was the right occasion to finally open it. There was a strange, mechanical rhythm to the entire evening. Sloane smiled exactly when a smile was expected by social convention. She tilted her head at the precise angle of a woman performing the role of an affectionate spouse. We discussed the mild autumn weather, the recent traffic on the Schuylkill Expressway, and the minor plumbing issue in the guest bathroom. To an outside observer looking through the tall Victorian windows, it might have looked like a flawless picture of affluent domestic bliss. But I spend my days as the director of vendor compliance at Grayline Clinical Networks. My entire professional identity is built upon the ability to spot discrepancies, to identify when a complex system is operating outside its normal parameters. I look for the hidden liabilities in multi-million-dollar supply contracts. I know what a trap looks like before it springs. Tonight, Sloane was operating on a highly specific script, and I was acutely aware that I did not have access to the pages. Dessert was cleared away. The air in the dining room suddenly grew strangely thin and heavy at the same time. Sloane reached down to the floor, her manicured fingers pulling a thick, brown manila envelope from her oversized leather designer tote bag. The expensive leather scraped faintly against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the quiet room. She placed the heavy envelope flat on the polished mahogany surface, with a slow, deliberate movement. She slid it across the dark wood until it rested perfectly equidistant between my empty dessert plate and my half-full wine glass. A quiet, practiced smirk played on her pale pink lips. It was a look of manufactured mischief, a mask slipping into place. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely level, refusing to mirror the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. "It is just a prank," Sloane said, her laugh light and musical, though the sound did not reach her cold, watchful eyes. "A little shock therapy, just to spice up a marriage that has been getting a little too predictable, a little too comfortable lately. Go ahead. Open it." "Darling?" I looked at her face for a long, silent moment. I let the silence stretch, watching her eyes track my every micro-expression. Then, I reached out, unfastened the metal clasp of the envelope, and pulled out the thick stack of premium, heavyweight paper. The crisp white pages felt dense in my hands. The heavy, bold black font at the top center of the first page screamed its purpose: petition for dissolution of marriage. I did not gasp. I did not throw the stack of papers back at her face. I did not ask her if she had completely lost her mind. Instead, I did exactly what I do every single day when a hostile vendor tries to slip a terrible deal past my desk. I audited the document. My eyes scanned the dense, single-spaced legal text with clinical detachment. The text in front of me was not a generic template printed off a free legal website for a tasteless joke. It was a meticulously drafted, highly customized legal instrument. I flipped directly to the financial disclosure exhibits. The numbers were not random placeholders. They were terrifyingly, violently precise. The document listed our primary joint savings account down to the exact dollar amount of $82,412. It detailed my personal retirement portfolio, accurately estimating its current market value at $450,000. It even itemized the mid-century modern furniture in our living room, allocating the custom green velvet sofa to her and the vintage walnut record console to me. Nobody spends hundreds of dollars on billable legal hours to divide a record console for a dinner table prank. But as my trained eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the cold, calculated dismantling of my 11-year relationship, I found it, the flaw, the oversight, the tiny fatal error that someone who was focused entirely on the offensive attack would inevitably miss. It was buried on page 7, under the detailed schedule of real property. The draft clearly and legally stipulated that the Chestnut Hill brownstone, the very house we were currently sitting in, was acknowledged by both parties as my separate, premarital property. It explicitly stated it originated from my family estate, allowing for only a severely limited reimbursement clause for the aesthetic renovations Sloane had managed over the years. It was a catastrophic strategic error on her part. Knowing Sloane, and knowing the crushing, whispered debt her interior design studio was currently hiding from clients and creditors, she would inevitably come after the massive equity in this house. She would absolutely need it to survive the coming year. But here, in undeniable black and white ink, in a pre-litigation document she had clearly commissioned, reviewed, and brought into my home, she had formally conceded the highest ground before the battle had even officially begun. She had legally admitted the house was completely mine. The silence in the dining room stretched further, pulled tight as a piano wire. Sloane was watching me intently, waiting for the inevitable explosion. She was waiting for the tears to well up, for the desperate pleading to understand why, for the emotional shock that would allow her to step in and control the entire narrative of the evening. She wanted me to become the hysterical, out-of-control wife, so she could seamlessly play the calm, rational victim of my emotional outburst. I flatly refused to give her the lines she had spent days memorizing her reactions for. Beside the polished silver salt and pepper shakers rested a heavy, black ink fountain pen I had used earlier that afternoon to write her a sentimental anniversary card. I reached out, my hand perfectly, chillingly steady. I picked up the heavy brass barrel of the pen. I smoothly unscrewed the cap and placed it on the table. I flipped the thick stack of papers back to page 1. At the bottom right corner, there was a neat dotted line with my full legal name printed beneath it. I pressed the sharp metal nib to the paper and signed my name with fluid precision. The loud, wet scratch of the pen was the only sound in the dead quiet of the room. I turned to page 3. Another dotted line, another swift, binding signature. I turned carefully to page 7, directly below the specific clause acknowledging my sole ownership of the brownstone estate, and signed my initials with sharp, aggressive strokes that nearly tore through the paper. When I finally looked up from the documents, the practiced smirk was completely gone from Sloane's face. The physical transformation of her features was slow and magnificent to witness. The confident, amused gleam in her eyes shattered like dropped glass. Her perfectly arched eyebrows drew together in deep, genuine confusion. Her breath hitched audibly in her throat. The carefully constructed, flawless facade of the evening cracked wide open, revealing the raw, panicked, unprepared woman underneath. "Harper," she whispered, her voice entirely losing its breathy, theatrical affectation, replaced instantly by raw, genuine alarm. "What on earth are you doing?" I did not answer her question. I calmly turned to the final page, found the execution clause, and signed my full name, writing out the date and the exact time of evening in the provided margins. I screwed the cap back onto the fountain pen and set it down precisely parallel to the edge of the signed documents. She was staring at the signed pages as if they had suddenly caught fire on the mahogany table. The script she had written had been entirely thrown out, and she was left stranded on the stage without a prompt. She had expected a messy fight. She had expected to have to soothe me or defend herself. She had never, in her wildest strategic planning sessions, expected immediate, cold compliance. I gathered the papers into my hands, tapping the bottom edges sharply against the hard mahogany table to align them perfectly. I slid the thick, now legally binding stack back across the dark wood, pushing it right until the edge touched the round base of her crystal wine glass. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, invading her space just enough to make her flinch. I looked directly into her wide, terrified blue eyes. "If it is a joke, you lose nothing," I said, my voice dropping down to a register barely above a whisper, entirely devoid of the hot anger she was so desperate to see. "But if it is not, then you just started something you cannot control. I am a woman who lives entirely by the laws of discipline. My entire adult life has been carefully constructed around the ability to foresee risk where others only see a routine transaction. At Greyline Clinical Networks, my official corporate title is Director of Vendor Compliance, but my actual function within the hierarchy is far more predatory. I am the apex predator of the fine print. When our massive hospital network prepares to purchase $70 million worth of advanced surgical robotics, or when we negotiate a complex, 5-year international logistics contract, I am the one locked in a quiet, fluorescent-lit office, hunting for the single ambiguous clause that could cost us everything. I know exactly how to spot a lie buried deep within 80 pages of dense legal jargon. I understand that a misplaced comma or a vague definition of liability is rarely an accident. It is almost always a trapdoor waiting to be sprung by an opportunistic vendor. I spend 40 to 50 hours a week tearing apart other people's words, looking for the exact moment their promises turn into our financial ruin. People who spend their days aggressively anticipating disaster usually crave absolute security when they clock out for the evening. That psychological need was my fatal blind spot. I brought my ruthless hypervigilance to the office, but I willingly left it in the concrete parking garage when I drove home every night. In my marriage, I was a loyalist to an absolute fault. I believed that the vows we took 8 years ago, building upon the 3 beautiful, chaotic years we had spent together before that, were the ultimate, unbreakable binding contract, a contract spanning 11 years in total, built purely on good faith, mutual respect, and a shared vision of our future together, not on hidden agendas or calculated exit strategies. We never had children. It was not a deliberate, dramatic, or tearful choice to remain a family of 2. It was simply a casualty of 2 highly demanding, all-consuming careers and a perpetual, naive belief that there would always be more time ahead of us. First, we delayed the conversation because I was aggressively pushing for the director promotion at Greyline, working 70-hour weeks to secure my executive position. Then, we decided to wait because of the massive, 18-month structural overhaul of our ground floor, a chaotic project that consumed all our free time and extra capital. Lately, over the past 2 or 3 years, the topic had just become a casual, fleeting refrain. We would look at each other over the Sunday morning coffee, surrounded by fabric swatches and legal briefs, and softly agree. We will seriously discuss it next spring. But next spring never seemed to actually arrive, and we seamlessly filled the quiet, empty spaces of our home with more work and more obligations. Sloane's daily reality was the exact opposite of mine. I dealt exclusively in undeniable facts, strict regulations, and concrete numbers. She dealt in highly expensive, ephemeral illusions. Mercer House Atelier, her boutique interior staging studio, catered to a very specific, ultra-wealthy echelon of society. She transformed empty, echoing, sterile mansions into vibrant, desperately desirable homes so ambitious real estate developers could sell them for 20 or sometimes 30% over the initial asking price. Sloane lived entirely on the volatile, shifting currency of aesthetics, public image, and social perception. She thrived at elite gallery openings, exclusive charity galas, and on a glossy, meticulously curated social media feed that projected an image of effortless perfection. Her core clients were the type of people who would happily drop $40,000 on custom imported Persian rugs without blinking an eye, but would ruthlessly argue over a $100 delivery fee just to prove a point about their wealth. She knew exactly how to handle them. She knew how to flatter their massive egos, how to soothe their irrational anxieties, and how to make them truly believe that her exceptional, refined taste was actually their own original idea. During our first 5 or 6 years together, our radically opposing natures created a brilliant, perfectly balanced ecosystem. I provided the heavy, unshakable foundation. I was the steady, predictable income, the pragmatic logistical planner, the heavy iron anchor that kept her from floating away on a chaotic cloud of artistic anxiety and missed deadlines. In return, Sloane brought the light into my life. She filled our shared existence with vibrant energy, dragging me out of my rigid spreadsheets and into a world of rich colors, spontaneous weekend trips to the coast, and a constantly rotating cast of fascinating, exhausting, brilliant people. She ensured that our existence was never, ever dull, but slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the climate in our home began to fundamentally change. Looking back with the cold clarity I have now, the shift started roughly 12 months ago. It manifested in tiny, physical details that my professionally trained brain registered, but my fiercely loyal heart violently refused to process. It was the way her expensive smartphone was suddenly always placed face down on the granite kitchen island, a defensive posture she had never utilized before. It was the subtle, unexplained change in her numeric lock screen code. It was the sudden, sharp increase in vague evening client meetings that stretched late into the night, yet somehow, mysteriously, never resulted in new, tangible staging contracts for her increasingly quiet studio. Even more disturbing than the unexplained schedule changes was the fundamental alteration in her personality and her daily interactions with me. The Sloane I had married was fiery, quick to argue passionately about trivial things like the color of a throw pillow, and fiercely, messily affectionate. The Sloane of the past 12 months had become strangely, artificially smooth. Her gentleness toward me no longer felt like genuine love. It felt like a tactical, measured deployment of affection. When she asked about my day at the hospital network, her tone completely lacked genuine curiosity. It was the exact, calculated tone a corporate crisis manager uses when pacifying a difficult, potentially litigious stakeholder. She was actively managing my impressions, carefully ensuring we never had a real explosive fight. She was wrapping our daily interactions in a thick layer of synthetic bubble wrap. She was meticulously making sure I had absolutely no reason to complain to our mutual friends or anyone outside our walls. And then, there was the sudden, undeniable omnipresence of Mara Voss. I had known Mara since we were 19 years old. Sitting in damp, poorly lit university libraries, drinking terrible dining hall coffee and complaining about our heavy course loads. We had naturally drifted apart over the decades, as people often do when their lives take different trajectories. But recently, Mara had aggressively reinvented herself. She was no longer just an ambitious psychology graduate. She was a highly sought-after, premium-priced family mediation strategist. She catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy elite of the city, guiding them through what she publicly and proudly marketed as conscious uncoupling. In reality, behind the soft pastel branding and the soothing website copy, she was a high-end emotional mercenary. She specialized in the weaponization of modern therapy language. She knew exactly how to use popular concepts to manipulate public sympathy. She was an expert at isolating a target while making the aggressor look like a brave, wounded survivor. Over the last 6 months, Mara had seamlessly and deeply inserted herself into Sloane's daily orbit. Her name became a constant, irritating hum in the background of our lives. Sloane would casually mention during breakfast, "Mara suggested I read this new book on finding my authentic center." Or she would say, after a long, hushed phone call in the hallway, "Mara thinks I need to establish firmer boundaries with my demanding clients." Mara was suddenly everywhere. She had become an invisible, guiding architect, actively advising my wife on how to navigate and reshape her emotional landscape. I had not drawn any final, devastating conclusions before that specific evening at the dining table. I had not hired a private investigator to trail her car, nor had I attempted to hack into her protected laptop. But the quiet, persistent alarms in my head, the exact same alarms that usually warned me about a fraudulent international vendor or a highly toxic supply chain, were ringing with a deafening, impossible-to-ignore volume. My professional instincts, honed over thousands of hours of looking for the absolute worst in corporate behavior, told me a dark, undeniable truth about my own personal life. Marriages usually break because of a spontaneous, uncontrollable combustion of raw emotion. They shatter from a sudden, violent betrayal, a screaming argument in the driveway, or a slow, agonizing fade of daily affection. But the fracture in my marriage did not feel organic in the slightest. It felt entirely administrative. The growing, polite distance between Sloane and me was not a tragic symptom of a dying romance. It was a required, calculated buffer for a strategic rollout. The end of our marriage was not being driven by a messy, passionate affair or a simple broken heart. It was being coldly executed through hidden documents, carefully calculated behaviors, and a meticulous, step-by-step exit strategy. And hovering right above it all, pulling the strings from the shadows, was a third party who understood exactly how to provoke, predict, and ultimately profit from the exact way a betrayed spouse would predictably react. They were building a public narrative, piece by piece, fully anticipating that I would play the assigned role of the blind, devastated, out-of-control wife. They just forgot to factor in what I did for a living, and how thoroughly I read the fine print. The gray light of early morning spilled through the kitchen windows, harsh and unforgiving. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. I walked down the wooden stairs, the quiet creak of the steps echoing in the otherwise silent house. The warm, candlelit illusion of the previous evening was entirely gone, replaced by the sterile, clinical reality of a Tuesday morning. Sloane was already sitting at the massive marble kitchen island. She was wearing a thick cashmere robe, her hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug of black coffee. The heavy stack of white paper, the very same document I had methodically signed the night before, was spread out across the cold stone surface. The pages were no longer neatly aligned. They were scattered, as if she had spent the hours between midnight and dawn frantically reading and rereading them, trying to figure out how her airtight script had derailed so spectacularly. When I walked in, she did not look up immediately. She waited exactly 5 seconds, a calculated pause designed to make me feel the weight of her displeasure, before raising her eyes. Her face was pale, stripped of the flawless makeup from the anniversary dinner, but her expression was actively shifting. She was trying to reset the board. "I cannot believe you," she said, her voice trembling with just the right amount of manufactured disbelief. "I really cannot believe you're doing this, Harper." I walked past her, reaching for the espresso machine. I did not speak. I simply loaded a pod and pressed the button, letting the loud, grinding hum of the machine fill the uncomfortable silence. "Are you just going to ignore me?" she demanded, her volume rising a fraction. "Are you going to throw away almost a decade of marriage over a stupid, tasteless joke because that is exactly what you are doing? You are destroying us over a complete misunderstanding. You always take things too far. You always have to prove a point." It was a masterful pivot. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a fraction of a second, a weaker person might have actually questioned their own sanity. She was desperately trying to retreat to the safety of her initial narrative, the narrative where she was the fun, spontaneous wife who made a slight misjudgment, and I was the rigid, unforgiving corporate drone who blew a minor prank completely out of proportion. I picked up my small cup of espresso, turned around, and leaned against the counter. I looked directly at the scattered pages on the marble island, then back up to her face. "A joke," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any accusatory heat. "A prank to spice things up." "Yes," she insisted, leaning forward, her eyes wide and pleading. "It was just supposed to be a shock, a wake-up call for us." "You are completely overreacting." I took a slow sip of the dark, bitter coffee. "An interesting choice of a wake-up call. Tell me, Sloane, does a spontaneous prank usually include a comprehensive real estate appraisal of this property, updated within the last 30 days? Her jaw tightened. The pleading look in her eyes flickered, replaced briefly by a flash of genuine panic. I set the cup down. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The facts were heavy enough to crush the air out of the room. "Does a prank know that my primary retirement account sits at exactly $450,212? Because I only received that updated quarterly statement last Tuesday, and I have not opened the mail in front of you." She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her the space. I pointed a steady finger at page 4, currently resting near her elbow. "Does a funny, spontaneous joke include a highly detailed, legally binding schedule of our personal property? It is remarkably specific. It allocates the custom green velvet sofa to you, the vintage walnut record console to me, and exactly splits the value of the art collection we bought in New York 3 years ago. That is not a joke. That is an itemized inventory." Sloane swallowed hard. Her hands tightened around her coffee mug until her knuckles turned completely white. She was trapped in the harsh light of undeniable evidence, but she was too deeply committed to the performance to simply drop the curtain. "I asked you a question last night," I continued, keeping my tone as conversational as if we were discussing the grocery list. "I want an answer now. Who helped you draft this?" She looked away, staring out the window at the empty street. "I do not know what you are talking about. I found a template online." "Do not insult my intelligence," I replied softly. "A free internet template does not correctly cite the specific Pennsylvania state statutes regarding the division of marital debt. Who helped you?" She took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes darting back to mine. She was searching for a safe harbor. A way to answer that gave away nothing but sounded legally plausible. "I did not hire a lawyer," she finally said, her chin lifting in a defensive posture. "If that is what you are implying, you are wrong. I just consulted someone who understands the process." The phrase hung in the quiet kitchen air, heavy and perfectly rounded. I just consulted someone who understands the process. It was not a casual statement. It was not the way a person speaks when seeking advice from a trusted friend or retaining a traditional attorney. It was a highly sanitized, incredibly specific piece of corporate therapy jargon. It was language meticulously designed to avoid legal liability while simultaneously establishing authoritative control over the situation. It was cold. It was circular. It was exactly the kind of sterile, manipulative phrasing that Mara Voss used every single time she opened her mouth. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, though I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. Mara. Of course it was Mara. The high-end family mediation strategist had been feeding Sloane these exact lines. Mara had designed this entire scenario. She had provided the psychological blueprint, the legal framework, and the exact vocabulary required to corner me. Sloane, mistaking my momentary silence for hesitation or weakness, immediately lunged for the emotional throat. She abandoned the failing defense of the paperwork and switched to a direct, vicious attack on my character. "Look at you," she sneered, her voice dripping with sudden, venomous disdain. She stood up from the stool, towering slightly over the island. You are standing there analyzing a piece of paper like it is a quarterly earnings report. Do you even have a heart? Harper? Did you ever actually love me? Did you ever actually care about this marriage at all? She gestured wildly toward the signed documents. You did not even hesitate last night. You did not cry. You did not ask me to stay. You just picked up a pen and signed our entire life away in under 3 minutes. What kind of cold, unfeeling person does that if you truly loved me? You would have fought for me. You would have ripped those papers to shreds. She was trying to make me the villain. She was desperately trying to force me into a defensive position, making me justify my lack of an emotional breakdown. She wanted me to apologize for not bleeding loudly enough when she stabbed me. I looked at the woman I had spent over a decade of my life with. I looked at the tailored cashmere robe, the perfectly manicured nails pointing an accusing finger at me, the eyes that were expertly trying to summon tears of victimhood. I picked up my car keys from the ceramic bowl on the counter. The metal jingled sharply in the quiet room. I looked down at the documents, at the first page resting directly in front of her. I did not fight you, Sloane, because you did not give me a fight, I said, my voice deadly calm. I reached out and tapped my index finger directly onto the blue ink of her name at the bottom of the page. And do not stand there and question my devotion to this marriage. You brought the loaded gun to the dinner table, and the person who signed these papers first was not me. I turned my back on her before she could formulate a response. I walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, and out the heavy oak front door, locking it firmly behind me. The crisp morning air hit my face as I walked down the brick path to my car. As I started the engine, the chaotic events of the past 12 hours suddenly snapped into a perfectly clear, terrifyingly logical sequence. The dinner, the prank, the hidden financial details, the specific phrasing she just used in the kitchen. Sloane had not just been preparing for a divorce. She had not simply wanted to end the marriage. Last night was a meticulously designed behavioral assessment. She had laid the papers on the table to test my exact reaction, to gather the final data points she needed before launching her real offensive. If I had exploded in anger, yelling and throwing things, she and Mara would have immediately activated a narrative painting me as an abusive, volatile partner she had to escape for her own safety. If I had broken down in tears, begging her to stay, they would have used my emotional devastation to quietly and quickly strip me of my assets, manipulating my grief into giving up the house to save the peace. By simply reading the document, spotting her fatal error regarding the property, and signing it without a single emotional outburst, I had completely broken their algorithm. I had refused to provide the reaction their strategy required. They had tested me to choose their weapon, and I had just handed them a bomb with a lit fuse. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the fallen autumn leaves. I was no longer a wife trying to save a failing marriage. I was a professional auditor, and I had just identified a massive, hostile breach of contract. The truth is, the entire performance at the anniversary dinner was built on a deeply flawed assumption. Sloane assumed I was walking into the dining room completely blind. She did not know that 72 hours earlier, I had already mapped out the exact dimensions of her betrayal. It started 4 days before the dinner, on a quiet Thursday evening. The weather had turned sharply cold, and Sloane was across town attending a high-profile networking gala for luxury commercial developers. I was sitting at the massive oak dining table, the same table where she would soon attempt to trap me, doing what I do best. I was running a routine, personal financial audit. Over the past 3 months, I had noticed a subtle, irregular rhythm in our primary joint checking account. They were not massive, alarming withdrawals that would trigger an automatic fraud alert from the bank. They were small, seemingly innocuous transfers. $315 on a Tuesday, $420 the following Monday, $295 on a Friday afternoon. Always transferred to an external routing number that was vaguely labeled as a generic processing system. Most spouses would dismiss these as expensive lunches, boutique fitness classes, or minor inventory purchases for a design studio. But my entire career is built on identifying the danger hiding within mundane patterns. These transfers were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, and entirely devoid of the corresponding physical receipts that usually littered our kitchen counter. I needed my heavy wool coat from the upstairs guest room closet to run out and grab dinner. I walked up the stairs, the house completely silent except for the faint hum of the central heating unit. I stepped into the spare room, which Sloane frequently used to store overflow materials for Mercer House Atelier. As I reached for the coat hanger, my peripheral vision caught something slightly out of place. It was a heavy slate gray presentation box, the kind used to hold premium Italian fabric samples. It was sitting on the top shelf, but it was pushed aggressively to the left, hanging perhaps half an inch over the edge of the custom oak shelving. It was a microscopic detail, but Sloane was a woman who made her living demanding absolute visual symmetry. She would arrange a coffee table for 3 hours to get the aesthetic balance perfectly right. She did not leave heavy boxes hanging crookedly off shelves unless she was in a frantic, uncharacteristic rush. I reached up and pulled the gray box down. It felt unusually heavy on one side. I lifted the magnetic lid. Inside, resting beneath a thick-textured swatch of imported beige linen, was a piece of cold, black glass and brushed aluminum. It was a smartphone, not her sleek, incredibly expensive primary device with the custom leather case. This was a generic, mid-tier model. It was the digital equivalent of a burner phone, hiding quietly in a box of decorative fabric in my own home. I picked it up. The device felt heavy and foreign in my palm. I pressed the small button on the side. The screen flared to life instantly, glowing brightly in the dim closet. There was no passcode required. There was no biometric lock. She was either incredibly arrogant, truly believing I would never dare to invade her sacred workspace, or simply careless. The screen opened directly to an encrypted messaging application. I did not need to dig through folders or guess passwords. The execution plan was sitting right there, illuminated in harsh white and blue text. There were 3 distinct conversation threads active. The first was labeled with the name Mara Voss. The second was a group chat containing Sloane, Mara, and a third contact simply named Owen Kessler. I recognized the name immediately from the financial news circuits. Owen Kessler managed a ruthless private equity firm downtown, specializing in distressed assets and high-interest bridge loans. He was not the kind of man you invited to a dinner party. He was the kind of man you called when your business was bleeding out and the traditional banks had stopped returning your calls. I opened the thread with Mara first. The timestamps indicated a frantic exchange that had occurred just 2 hours before Sloane left for her gala. "You have to place the papers on the table right after the second glass of wine," Mara had written. "Timing is absolutely critical. Do not let her start clearing the plates first." "What if she refuses to look at them?" Sloane had replied. "She is an auditor. She will not be able to resist reading a legal document placed directly in front of her," Mara responded. "Just remember the branching strategy. If she blows up, starts yelling, or throws the papers, we immediately pivot to narrative A. You stay quiet, you look frightened, and you leave the house. We document the hostility for the temporary hearing." I scrolled down, my thumb moving with slow mechanical precision. The air in the closet felt freezing, but my hands were not shaking. "What if she just signs it?" Sloane asked. "If she signs, we switch to narrative B," Mara wrote back. "We frame her as cold, detached, and completely uninvested in the marriage. We use that emotional abandonment to justify your need for an immediate, heavy financial settlement to rebuild your life. Either way, Harper is the aggressor, and you are the victim." I closed the thread. I was reading a psychological vivisection of my own character, designed by a woman I had known since college and executed by the woman I slept next to every night. They had mapped out my potential reactions like I was a predictable asset on a spreadsheet. They had engineered a scenario where, whether I fought for my marriage or walked away from it, I would be painted as the villain. I opened the group chat with Owen Kessler next. This was where the emotional manipulation translated directly into hard currency. I cannot extend the line of credit for the studio any further without hard, verifiable collateral. Sloane. Owen had written the previous morning. The commercial warehouse lease is exactly 90 days past due. The vendors are threatening to seize your current staging inventory. Sloane's reply was a masterclass in financial desperation masked as confident strategy. The post-divorce equity will easily cover the outstanding debt and fully fund the operating costs for the next 2 years. The Chestnut Hill house alone is valued at over $2 million. The legal filings start next week. I will have the settlement funds within 6 months. I need that projected equity confirmed on paper before I clear the vendor debts. Owen fired back. Get the initial filing done. Establish the claim on the property. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with a sickening, heavy thud. The entire divorce, the elaborate emotional theater, the sudden presence of Mara Voss. It was not about a broken heart. It was a corporate bailout. Mercer House Atelier was drowning in debt, crushed by unpaid warehouse fees and angry suppliers. Sloane had looked at our marriage, looked at the massive equity sitting in my family home, and decided to liquidate our relationship to save her failing vanity project. She was planning to use the house I had inherited, the house I had spent hundreds of hours carefully restoring, as collateral for a high-interest loan to a private equity shark. I stood in the closet for exactly 10 minutes. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not collapse onto the floor and weep. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally calculated, that it completely bypassed the emotional center of my brain and struck directly at my professional instincts. I was no longer a grieving spouse. I was a compliance officer investigating a massive, hostile takeover attempt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own smartphone. I opened the camera. I methodically photographed every single screen of the conversations. I made sure the timestamps, the contact names, and the specific dates were crystal clear in every high-resolution image. I documented the financial admissions with Owen Kessler. I captured the behavioral manipulation tactics outlined by Mara Voss. When I had everything safely secured in an encrypted folder on my own device, I pressed the power button on the burner phone, turning the screen back to black. I placed it gently back into the gray slate box. I carefully arranged the heavy beige linen swatch over the glass screen, ensuring the folds matched the exact way I had found them. I closed the magnetic lid. I lifted the box back onto the top shelf. I did not push it all the way back. I spent 20 seconds adjusting it until it hung exactly half an inch over the edge of the oak shelving, precisely mimicking her hasty, careless placement. I grabbed my wool coat, turned off the closet light, and walked downstairs to get my dinner. So, when Sloane slid that thick manila envelope across the mahogany dining table 3 days later, offering me her perfectly rehearsed smile and her fake, breathy laugh, she thought she was holding all the cards. She thought she was springing a brilliant, unavoidable trap on a naive, unsuspecting wife. She had absolutely no idea that I had already read the script, identified the directors, and traced the funding. Chassin. My quick silent signature was not an act of impulsive surrender. It was the deliberate, calculated closing of a steel door. I walked into that anniversary dinner with my eyes wide open, fully prepared to let her step off the cliff she had so carefully built. I made the phone call from a secure conference room on the 9th floor of the Gray Line Clinical Networks building, using a prepaid cellular device I purchased during my lunch break. I did not contact a therapist. I did not call my mother to cry. I called Naomi Bell, in the notoriously cutthroat legal circles of Philadelphia. Naomi was not known for her warm bedside manner. She was a senior divorce attorney who specialized exclusively in high-net-worth financial manipulation and corporate asset extraction. She did not advertise on public transit, and she did not take cases based on emotional distress. You hired Naomi when you needed someone to surgically dismantle a fraudulent financial structure and leave the architect with absolutely nothing. We met the following afternoon in her austere, glass-walled office overlooking Center City. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, aristocratic features, and a chilling demeanor that made a corporate tax audit feel like a casual social gathering. "I do not care if she cheated on you," Naomi said, before I had even fully settled into the heavy leather chair across from her desk. "I do not care if she is currently writing a theatrical, multi-part tragedy on the internet painting you as an abusive monster. Judges do not care about hurt feelings, Harper. They care about metadata. They care about undisclosed corporate entities. They care about ink on paper and the routing numbers of hidden bank accounts. Show me the paper." I handed her the thick manila envelope containing the original divorce draft I had signed, along with a printed, high-resolution dossier of the photographs I had taken from the hidden burner phone in the closet. Naomi put on a pair of silver-rimmed reading glasses and went to work. For exactly 45 minutes. The only sound in the large office was the crisp turning of pages and the occasional sharp tap of her heavy silver pen against the solid mahogany desk. She paused at the financial disclosures and the printouts of the encrypted messages. Then, she picked up her desk phone and dialed a 4-digit extension. "Get David in here immediately," she instructed her assistant. "Tell him to bring his forensic auditing software." David was a forensic accountant who looked entirely too young to be dealing with the brutal destruction of marriages. But over the next 4 hours, he proved to be a terrifyingly efficient architect of financial ruin. We pulled 18 months of my joint bank statements, meticulously cross-referencing every single withdrawal against the timeline and metadata extracted from Sloane's text messages. The pattern, which I had only caught a fleeting glimpse of earlier in the week, was now laid out under a glaring, undeniable spotlight. David identified a meticulously structured, long-term diversion of marital funds. The seemingly random transfers of $200 here and $350 there were not going to a generic processing system, as the bank line items falsely suggested. They were being funneled directly into a newly registered, single-member limited liability company. "M House Reserve," David read aloud, pointing his pen to a highlighted column on his secondary monitor. "Registered exactly 9 months ago in the state of Delaware. The sole managing member and registered agent is Sloane Mercer. She's been slowly bleeding the joint operating account to artificially inflate the capital of a shadow entity," Naomi stated, tapping her manicured finger against the edge of the desk. "But the small transfers are just the appetizer to test the waters. Look at the massive capital injection agreement from 3 weeks ago." David pulled up another digital document. There it was. A massive structured financial lifeline. It was a private bridge loan agreement between M House Reserve and the private equity fund managed by Owen Kessler. But it was the collateral clause buried on page 12 that made the air in the room turn instantly icy. Sloane had secured the high-interest funding by explicitly listing the anticipated equitable distribution of our Chestnut Hill estate as pending liquid assets. She had legally promised Owen Kessler a massive percentage of the equity in my family home to save her failing design studio from immediate bankruptcy. She was actively treating our marriage as a distressed corporate asset ready for aggressive liquidation. "This is highly illegal," Naomi murmured, a sharp, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. "She is encumbering marital assets prior to a formal court filing, based entirely on projected settlement outcomes. And she used Mara Voss to orchestrate the psychological pressure required to force that specific outcome." Then, Naomi picked up the physical stack of papers Sloane had slid across our dining table during the anniversary dinner. She flipped directly to the 7th page, the detailed property schedule. "This," Naomi said, holding the heavy paper up to the light as if inspecting a rare, flawless diamond, "is the absolute greatest gift an arrogant opponent could ever hand you on a silver platter." I looked at my own aggressive signature slashing across the bottom of the page. "I signed it because I knew the property clause was wrong for her financial strategy," I explained quietly. "But I did not fully understand the exact legal weight of it at the time." "Your professional instincts saved your life," Naomi replied, setting the paper down carefully on the leather blotter. "Sloane thought this was merely a psychological test, a cruel prank to measure your emotional temperature and establish a narrative. But she used a customized, pre-litigation document that she herself drafted and signed at the very top. By bringing this physical document into your home and presenting it to you, she created a binding preliminary admission. Naomi leaned forward, locking her dark, calculating eyes onto mine. Right here, in her own commissioned legal document, she explicitly designates the brownstone as your sole, premarital family asset. She formally waived her right to claim the primary equity. When she eventually files the real petition next week and tries to demand half the house to pay off Owen Kessler, we will drop this signed draft directly onto the judge's desk. She cannot easily retract a formal financial concession she originated and signed. The realization washed over me, cold and perfectly clear. The reason my hand had not shaken when I picked up that heavy brass fountain pen was because the corporate auditor inside me had instantly recognized the fatal flaw in the hostile vendor's contract. I had bound her entirely to her own mistake. Naomi folded her hands deliberately on the desk. Now, we establish the absolute rules of engagement moving forward. Sloane and Mara are currently building a public narrative. They are going to spin a tragic story of your emotional unavailability, your financial control, and your coldness. They want you to react. They need you to react to validate their claims. Naomi stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. You will not post a single word on any social media platform, she commanded, her voice echoing slightly against the glass pane. You will not send angry, emotional text messages to her late at night, when your mutual friends call you, fishing for the truth and offering fake sympathy. You will tell them it is a private legal matter and you wish her the absolute best. You will become a fortress of absolute, impenetrable silence. She's going to tell everyone in our social circle that I am a monster, I said, my voice completely steady. Let her, Naomi shot back, turning to face me with a look of fierce approval. The person who wins the narrative in the first 30 days almost always loses the case in the final month. They get incredibly sloppy. They start believing their own press releases. While she is busy curating her fake victimhood for an audience of strangers on the internet, we are going to quietly dismantle her financial life brick by brick. David handed me a thick, black binder containing all the printed evidence, the forensic spreadsheets, and the loan documents. It weighed heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of the impending war I was now fully equipped to fight. I walked out of Naomi Bell's office at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The city streets below were filled with chaotic rush-hour traffic, a noisy sea of red brake lights and blaring horns. But inside my own mind, there was nothing but perfect, absolute clarity. I was no longer the unsuspecting, loyal wife being subjected to a cruel psychological test in my own dining room. I was no longer the subject of a manipulation strategy drafted by a fraudulent therapist. I had stopped playing the pathetic role they had written for me. As I unlocked my car and tossed the heavy black binder onto the passenger seat, a profound shift occurred within my chest. I was not just defending myself anymore. I was the director of vendor compliance. I had just identified a catastrophic, malicious breach of contract, and I was about to execute the penalty clause with extreme prejudice. The chessboard was set, and I held every single piece that actually mattered. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of Naomi Bell's office, the digital offensive officially began. It launched simultaneously on both Instagram and her professional networking platform, precisely timed for maximum visibility during the evening commute. The post featured a highly curated, heavily filtered black and white photograph of Sloane looking thoughtfully out a rain-streaked window, her profile illuminated softly by natural light. The caption was an absolute masterclass in weaponized therapy speak, undoubtedly proofread and polished by Mara Voss. Sloane wrote 4 extensive paragraphs about the exhausting, deeply personal journey of courageously leaving a space that continually made me shrink. She spoke eloquently about reclaiming her authentic light, the painful necessity of establishing boundaries, and the deep, silent tragedy of outgrowing a rigid, unyielding environment. She never explicitly typed my name. She did not have to. Every single client, mutual friend, And nosy neighbor in Chestnut Hill knew exactly who the rigid environment was. She was building her invincible armor of victimhood in real time, gathering thousands of likes and supportive comments within the first 2 hours. My phone immediately began to vibrate against the kitchen counter. The messages trickled in, cleverly disguised as polite concern. "Sending you so much love during this difficult season," one pretentious art gallery owner texted. "Just checking in. I am here if you need to vent," wrote a neighbor who had never spoken to me for more than 2 minutes at our annual block party. I did not reply to a single one. I left the messages unread. Naomi had warned me about this exact phase of the battle. What fascinated me more than the fake sympathy was the absolute silence from certain quarters. The people who truly knew us, the ones with actual substance and intelligence, did not send a single text. Their silence was a quiet, powerful confirmation that they were not buying the glossy, highly produced tragedy Sloane was actively selling. I refused to fight her in the comment section. I did not post a retaliatory status or try to explain my side of the story to a digital audience hungry for domestic drama. Instead, I took 3 days of personal leave from Grayline Clinical Networks, traded my sharp corporate suits for jeans and a heavy wool sweater, and stepped completely outside our high society bubble to do the groundwork. First, I drove out to a bleak, gray industrial park on the edge of the city to meet the manager of the commercial warehouse where Mercer House Atelier stored its massive staging inventory. He was a tired, abrasive man in a neon vest who did not care about Instagram aesthetics. I bought him a black coffee and asked to see the ledger. Sloane was exactly 4 months behind on her lease, owing just over $14,000 in back rent. He was preparing to lock her out of the unit by the end of the week. Next, I sat in a brightly lit, greasy diner across from Sloane's former freelance accountant. She was a meticulous, highly anxious woman who had abruptly quit the studio 6 months ago, citing irreconcilable ethical differences. I slid a printed list of supposedly delinquent client accounts across the sticky laminate table. These were the ultra-wealthy clients Sloane had constantly complained about over our dinners. The ones she loudly claimed were ruining our household cash flow by stubbornly refusing to pay their final design invoices. The accountant glanced at the list, let out a harsh, dry laugh, and shook her head. "They were not late, Harper," the accountant said quietly, tapping her metal spoon against her coffee cup. "Every single one of these invoices was paid in full within 30 days of project completion. The one for the Rittenhouse Square penthouse, that wire transfer for $45,000 cleared 5 months ago. The money just never went into the primary business operating account, and it certainly never went to your joint household account." I verified this devastating truth later that afternoon with the general contractor who had renovated our ground floor 2 years prior. Standing in the cold wind at a construction site, he confirmed that Sloane had asked him to dramatically inflate certain repair estimates on paper, specifically for structural work that was never actually performed. She was intentionally skimming cash off the top of our own home improvement loans. The entire narrative she had spun over the past year about carrying the heavy financial weight of the world while waiting for ungrateful clients to pay was a complete and utter fabrication. The money existed. It had simply been rerouted into the shadows to feed M House Reserve. The final, world-shattering blow did not come from a corporate spreadsheet or a warehouse manager. It came via a phone call on a rainy Thursday afternoon from Aunt Elaine. Elaine was my late father's older sister. She was a sharp, fiercely private woman who had spent 42 years working as a senior title examiner for the county records department. She did not use social media, but family gossip travels through analog lines just as efficiently. She had heard whispers about the impending divorce and called me, demanding I bring her a physical copy of the house deed and any recent property filings just to ensure the family estate was secure. I sat in her floral-patterned living room, drinking weak Earl Grey tea, while she adjusted her thick bifocals and held a heavy brass magnifying glass over a specific document I had pulled from the county portal. It was a general power of attorney form that Sloane had supposedly filed 8 months ago. granting herself broad administrative authority over the Chestnut Hill property under the guise of expediting some exterior renovation permits. "Harper," Aunt Elaine said, her voice completely devoid of its usual grandmotherly warmth. It was the clinical tone of a seasoned investigator finding the murder weapon. "Look right here at the notary stamp." She pointed a weathered, slightly trembling finger at the bottom of the white page. "The commission expiration date on this stamp is 3 years from now. But I know for a fact this specific notary retired and permanently surrendered his stamp over 14 months ago. He moved to Florida. I personally attended his retirement party." I leaned in, staring at the blue ink pressed into the paper. Aunt Elaine slid the document an inch closer to me. "Now look at your signature. It is your signature, certainly. But see the microscopic pixelation around the loops of the ink, and the way it slightly overlaps the printed line without actually bleeding into the paper fibers. This is a digital composite. Someone took a high-resolution scan of your signature from an older document, likely the original roofing permit from 4 years ago. Digitally pasted it onto this new power of attorney form and stamped it with a fraudulent, backdated notary seal." I sat back against the floral cushions, the cold tea completely forgotten in my hands. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I stared at the forged document, the very mechanism Sloane intended to use to leverage my family home for Owen Kessler's bridge loan. She needed this fraudulent power of attorney to completely bypass my authorization when the time came to secure the debt. The coldness in my chest solidified into something entirely unbreakable. The parameters of the war had fundamentally and violently changed. This was no longer a tragic domestic dispute about a wife who felt stifled and emotionally neglected. It was no longer a philosophical debate over who had stopped trying, who had betrayed whom, or whose feelings were hurt the most. It had escalated far past the realm of family court and landed squarely in the territory of a calculated, criminal enterprise. The woman I married was not simply trying to leave me to find her authentic self. She was actively trying to launder her hidden corporate debt and orchestrate the wholesale theft of my family's legacy. She was building an altar of victimhood on the internet to distract everyone while she robbed the vault. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 swung open at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the judicial chamber was distinctly stale, carrying the faint, permanent scent of polished wood, floor wax, and decades of bitter disputes. I sat beside Naomi Bell at the polished respondents' table. My posture was perfectly straight, my hands folded quietly in my lap. Sloane was already seated across the aisle at the petitioner's table. The visual transformation she had undergone for this specific morning was nothing short of theatrical brilliance. The woman who routinely wore highly structured, aggressive designer suits to intimidate her wealthy clients was completely gone. In her place sat a fragile, seemingly broken spouse. She wore a simple, unadorned charcoal gray cardigan draped loosely over a high-necked, modest white blouse. Her ash-blonde hair, usually styled into a flawless, sharp bob, was pulled back into a soft, slightly messy knot at the nape of her neck. Her makeup was expertly applied to create the illusion of chronic exhaustion, highlighting the pale skin under her eyes. Whenever the presiding judge glanced in her direction, Sloane subtly lowered her gaze to the table, her hands trembling just a fraction of an inch. She was a living, breathing portrait of a traumatized woman desperate for sanctuary. Her attorney, a sharp-featured man with a surprisingly warm, resonant voice, stood up to deliver his opening request. He painted a devastating, highly curated picture of our marriage. He formally requested that the court grant his client immediate and exclusive use of our Chestnut Hill estate during the pendency of the divorce proceedings. He argued that the home was her only safe space. Furthermore, he aggressively demanded a temporary spousal support order of $12,000 per month. "My client's highly successful interior design business has completely stalled," her attorney stated, projecting his voice to fill the high-ceilinged room. "She is currently suffering from a severe, debilitating emotional crisis directly brought on by a deeply toxic and unsupportive marital environment. The respondent's rigid, controlling behavior has rendered my client temporarily unable to maintain her own professional livelihood or secure alternative housing. Naomi Bell did not dramatically object. She did not roll her eyes or lean forward in protest. When the judge finally turned to our table, Naomi stood up with the terrifying, unhurried calm of a professional executioner. She did not play our heavy hands. The forged, digitally manipulated power of attorney and the explosive private equity collateral agreements involving Owen Kessler remained securely locked inside her dark leather briefcase. Naomi understood the rhythm of a kill. She was saving the fatal, undeniable blow for the final trial. When the stakes were absolute, today, she only needed to create the first, irreparable crack in their carefully constructed narrative. Naomi began by handing the bailiff a neatly bound, black financial folder to present to the judge. "Your Honor," Naomi said, her voice crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. "Before we address the petitioner's sudden inability to work, we must first address where her current income has actually been going. I direct the court's attention to the forensic accounting summary in front of you." Naomi methodically outlined the existence of the secret limited liability company, M House Reserve. She detailed the steady, unauthorized diversion of marital funds over the past 9 months, spelling out the exact sums transferred behind my back. Sloane's attorney immediately jumped up, stammering an objection, loudly claiming these were simply routine, legitimate business transfers necessary for her studio's operation. The judge, a stern woman with incredibly sharp, observing eyes, held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. She spent a long, agonizing minute scanning the highlighted rows of the forensic spreadsheet. Then, Naomi reached into her file and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope from our anniversary dinner. She requested permission to approach the witness stand, where Sloane was now seated under oath for cross-examination regarding her sworn financial affidavit. Naomi placed the dense stack of paper directly on the wooden ledge in front of my wife. "Mrs. Mercer, do you recognize this physical document?" Naomi asked, stepping back to allow the judge a clear view of Sloane's face. Sloane looked down at the papers. The muscles in her jaw tightened. Her throat swallowed hard. A visible, panicked gulp. "It is just a worthless template," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for the court reporter to accurately capture the hesitation. "It was meant to be a prank, a silly joke to see if my wife even cared about our marriage anymore. It has absolutely no legal value." Naomi stepped half a pace closer, entirely ignoring the emotional defense. "I am not asking the court to rule on its final legal standing at this exact moment, Mrs. Mercer. I am asking about its specific origin. Did you personally procure, review, draft, and physically present this specific document to your wife prior to any formal, documented legal separation?" Sloane glanced desperately across the room at her attorney. He offered her nothing but a slight, grim grimace. He could not save her from a direct question about a physical action. "Yes," Sloane whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden stand. "I put the wording together. I just wanted to show her how serious things were getting." "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice ringing out like a bell in the dead quiet of the room. She turned sharply toward the bench. "Your Honor, I direct your specific attention to page 7 of the petitioner's own drafted and presented document. In the very text, Mrs. Mercer just admitted under oath to preparing and presenting. She explicitly and clearly designates the property located in Chestnut Hill as the sole premarital asset of the respondent, Harper James. She is now standing before this exact court, demanding the exclusive use of a massive physical asset that she previously, in her own chosen words, conceded she has absolutely no primary claim to." The judge flipped forcefully to page 7 of her copy. The silence in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy, thick enough to suffocate a fire. The judge looked up from the paper and stared directly at Sloane. The sympathetic, protective gaze she had offered the fragile victim just 20 minutes earlier was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, hardened judicial skepticism. Judges despise being used as pawns in a manipulation game, and Naomi had just expertly revealed the strings. The judge did not immediately throw the entire divorce case out of court, but the momentum of the room shifted violently and permanently. The petitioner's request for exclusive use of the marital residence is firmly denied, the judge announced, her heavy wooden gavel coming down with a sharp, echoing crack. The respondent may remain in the home without restriction. Furthermore, given the extremely troubling revelation of undisclosed corporate entities and the contradictory statements regarding property claims, I am ordering an extended comprehensive financial disclosure from the petitioner. You have exactly 30 days to produce every single ledger, bank statement, tax filing, and communication associated with M House Reserve and Mercer House Atelier. We are adjourned. We walked out of the heavy double doors and stepped into the brightly lit, echoing corridor of the courthouse. The intense, suffocating tension from the chamber spilled out into the hallway with us. While Naomi was speaking quietly with the court clerk near the elevators, I stood alone beside a massive marble pillar, buttoning my wool coat. Sloane emerged through the doors a moment later. Her attorney was already walking briskly away down the hall, holding his briefcase tightly and looking incredibly irritated by the sudden disaster he now had to manage. Sloane stopped a few feet away from me. The fragile but wounded victim persona she had worn so flawlessly for the past 2 hours was completely gone, stripped away by the brutal reality of the judge's orders. Her face was tight, her posture rigid, and her blue eyes were wide with a genuine, unscripted fear. The reality of the mandated forensic audit was finally sinking into her bones. She knew exactly what our forensic accountant would find if they forcefully dug into the studio's hidden ledgers. She knew her private equity lifeline was rapidly unraveling. She took a slow, hesitant step toward me. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a deeply defensive posture attempting to shield herself from the cold draft in the hall. "You did not need to do that," she said. Her voice had entirely dropped its soft, breathy affectation, revealing the hard, desperate, and bitter edge buried beneath. "You did not need to go this far. Harper, we could have handled this quietly. You are trying to completely destroy my business over a simple mistake." I looked at her, searching myself for any lingering trace of pity, any ghost of the absolute love I had held for 11 years. I found absolutely nothing but the cold, hollow satisfaction of a perfectly executed professional strategy. "You brought the law to the dinner table first," I replied, my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable landed exactly where it was meant to strike. "I am just the one who bothered to read it all." The mandatory financial disclosure ordered by the judge blew the heavy doors completely off Sloane's carefully guarded fortress. But the most devastating piece of shrapnel did not come from a bank ledger. It came from a sweeping digital subpoena Naomi had quietly filed the morning after our first court victory, demanding all electronic communications and strategic notes between Mercer House Atelier and Mara Voss's private mediation firm. When the encrypted zip file arrived at Naomi's office exactly 14 days later, I sat at the massive glass conference table and began to read. I had already survived the initial shock of finding the burner phone hidden in the closet. I truly thought I knew exactly how deep the deception went. I was completely wrong. The woman sleeping next to me had pulled the trigger, but the person who meticulously designed the weapon, loaded the chamber, and calculated the wind resistance was supposed to be my trusted friend. The subpoenaed cache contained over 300 pages of emails, shared cloud documents, and billed invoicing hours. Mara had not merely offered Sloane a sympathetic ear or casual advice on finding her authentic self. Mara was the primary architect of the entire operation. The official documents proved that Mara was the one who initially connected my wife with Owen Kessler. There was a formal introductory email dated 7 months prior, where Mara aggressively pitched Sloane's marital equity as a highly viable, low-risk collateral opportunity for Kessler's private equity firm. Mara had essentially brokered the destruction of my marriage for a high-society networking favor. But the financial maneuvering, as sickening as it was, did not break my composure. My composure shattered completely when I opened a digital file cleanly titled Harper James Behavioral Profile and Negotiation Strategy. I stared at the glowing screen of the laptop, the crisp black text blurring slightly as my stomach plummeted. The document was an incredibly detailed, psychological vivisection of my personality, designed specifically to build the absolute perfect narrative for family court and public consumption on social media. It described me as fundamentally cold, emotionally unapproachable, and hopelessly obsessed with absolute control. It painted a picture of a woman who viewed her own home not as a sanctuary, but as a rigid corporate boardroom to be managed with an iron fist. Those specific phrases hit me with a visceral, suffocating force: cold, unapproachable, obsessed with control. They were not random insults Sloane had invented during a bitter, late-night argument. They were my own deeply guarded words. My mind violently pulled me back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon exactly 4 years ago. Sloane and I had been going through a particularly exhausting rough patch, struggling with the chaotic, endless structural renovations of the ground floor. I had met Mara for coffee at a small cafe near Rittenhouse Square. I had been exhausted, incredibly vulnerable, and deeply insecure about the toll my demanding corporate job at Greyline was taking on my personality. I am terrified that I'm becoming too cold. I had confessed to Mara that day, staring down into a ceramic cup of chamomile tea. I spend 50 hours a week hunting for catastrophic errors, controlling every single variable in these massive supply contracts. I am so scared I'm bringing that obsession with control back into my marriage. I do not want to be unapproachable to my own wife. Mara had reached across the small cafe table, placing her warm hand gently over mine. She had looked at me with those deep, empathetic eyes that she now used to sell her premium mediation services to the elite. "You are just disciplined, Harper," Mara had said, her voice dripping with manufactured comfort and validation. "You are holding the heavy foundation together. You are not cold. You are simply carrying way too much weight for one person." Now, 4 years later, I was looking at those exact vulnerabilities, those deeply private fears I had handed to her in complete confidence, thoroughly weaponized in a legal strategy document. Mara had sat in my living room, drinking expensive wine on the very custom green velvet sofa she later advised Sloane to claim in the divorce. She had complimented the dark mahogany wainscoting while secretly calculating its exact market value for a private equity collateral sheet. Mara had taken my deepest insecurities, stripped them entirely of their context, and fed them directly to Sloane to construct a bulletproof, sympathetic narrative of emotional abuse. Mara knew exactly what psychological buttons to push, because I had personally handed her the user manual. I did not yell. I did not throw the heavy laptop across the immaculate corporate office. I did not shed a single tear. I fell into a heavy, suffocating silence that was infinitely darker than any anger I had ever experienced in my entire life. Anger is hot, loud, and reactive. This silence was absolute zero. The betrayal was no longer just about a failing marriage or a desperate scramble for hidden money. It was a profound, multi-layered violation of my basic reality. The two women I had trusted most in this world had sat in a room and coldly dismantled my humanity to secure a bridge loan. The heavy glass door to the conference room opened, and Naomi walked in, followed closely by Aunt Elaine. I had asked Elaine to come in to help systematically review some of the older property records that had been digitized in the subpoena cache. She walked over and placed a comforting, wrinkled hand on my shoulder, immediately sensing the absolute drop in the room's temperature. "Look at this," Naomi said, her voice unusually subdued, entirely devoid of its usual predatory excitement. She leaned over my shoulder and clicked on the file properties of the original draft divorce petition. The exact same document Sloane had slid across the mahogany dining table on our anniversary. Naomi opened the metadata history panel. The digital footprint was undeniable and permanently stamped into the file. The document had not been downloaded from a random legal template website by a desperate, unhappy wife. As Sloane had sworn under oath, the metadata proved the file was originally authored on a computer formally registered to Mara Voss. Furthermore, the document had gone through exactly 14 distinct revision cycles over a period of 3 weeks, entirely on Mara's machine, before it was ever printed and brought into my home. Mara had carefully tweaked the legal language, adjusted the asset columns, and perfectly calibrated the phrasing of the property clause that Sloane had ultimately choked on. Aunt Elaine adjusted her thick bifocals, pointing a weathered finger at a specific embedded comment bubble left carelessly in the digital margins of the final draft. "Read that," Elaine instructed, her voice tight with quiet, dignified fury. The comment was left by Mara's primary user account, attached directly to the final signature block. It read, "Force Harper to choose between exploding or signing. Do not give her a third option. Both reactions are highly beneficial for the final financial settlement if we lock down and control the public narrative first." I leaned back in the heavy leather executive chair, the stale, air-conditioned air slowly returning to my lungs. The entire architecture of their psychological trap was now completely exposed under harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light. Sloane truly thought she was a brilliant actress executing a flawless, unstoppable script, but she was just a desperate, heavily indebted puppet. Mara was the true director, manipulating the financial crisis, actively exploiting my psychological vulnerabilities, and writing the specific legal traps, all while hiding safely behind the sterile, unassailable title of a healing strategist. "They really thought I was just a rigid corporate drone," I said quietly, the sound of my own voice foreign and hollow to my ears. "They genuinely thought I would either scream like a madwoman or sign like a defeated coward. And instead, you audited them," Naomi replied, closing the laptop screen with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed in the quiet room. "We now have concrete, undeniable proof of a coordinated, malicious conspiracy to defraud a marital estate. We have the digital metadata proving the fraudulent origins of the pre-litigation documents she swore were casual templates. We have the written strategy to inflict emotional distress for calculated financial gain. And most importantly, we have the direct connective tissue linking the family mediator directly to the hostile private equity firm." I stood up slowly from the glass conference table. The heavy, crushing weight of the double betrayal did not magically vanish, but it fundamentally transformed within my chest. It hardened into something incredibly sharp, highly efficient, and absolutely merciless. I was no longer just aggressively defending my family home or protecting my retirement accounts from a greedy, manipulative spouse. I was preparing to completely annihilate the professional reputation of a woman who used the sacred trust of deep friendship as a weapon of mass destruction. I finally had the complete blueprint of their elaborate trap, and it was absolutely time to lock the doors from the outside. Naomi struck with the absolute precision of a guided corporate missile. We no longer operated under the defensive, reactionary posture of a blindsided spouse trying to mitigate a sudden divorce. We shifted entirely to a scorched earth offensive. First, Naomi filed a highly aggressive emergency injunction with the county court, effectively placing a frozen lock on any and all transactions, liens, or encumbrances tied to the Chestnut Hill estate. The legal maneuver was an iron wall. It completely severed the anticipated equity from the financial markets. The bridge loan was dead in the water. Owen Kessler could not legally touch a single brick of my home, and Mercer House Atelier was officially starved of its desperately needed, fraudulent capital. But I refused to stop at the relatively polite boundaries of family court. I authorized Naomi to formally prepare an ancillary civil lawsuit targeting the massive financial fraud and the explicitly forged power of attorney that Aunt Elaine had uncovered. We were no longer simply dissolving a broken marriage. We were meticulously prosecuting a multi-layered white-collar crime. I stopped treating Sloane like an estranged wife and began treating her exactly like a highly hostile, deeply corrupt vendor who had actively attempted to breach a multi-million-dollar corporate contract. That same evening, while the house sat in deafening silence, I conducted a thorough, localized digital audit of my own home. We had installed a comprehensive smart home security system 3 years prior, primarily to monitor the perimeter and the front entrance while we were both working long hours. I opened the encrypted application on my tablet and accessed the secure cloud storage servers. I deliberately scrubbed the timeline back to the evening of our 8th anniversary, specifically targeting the 90 minutes before I had come downstairs to check on the dinner preparations. The camera mounted in the corner of the formal living room possessed an incredibly sensitive microphone and flawless high-definition resolution. The footage I retrieved was utterly damning. It was the missing puzzle piece that elevated their scheme from implied manipulation to documented, premeditated emotional abuse. Sloane was pacing frantically across the vintage Persian rug. Her secondary burner phone was resting flat on the glass coffee table, clearly set to a high-volume speakerphone. The audio picked up Mara Voss's distinct, measured voice with terrifying clarity. Mara was not just offering friendly support. She was actively directing a live theatrical rehearsal. You have to pause for exactly 3 seconds after you slide the envelope across the mahogany wood. Mara's voice instructed through the tiny digital speaker. Do not rush the silence. Wait for her micro-expressions. If she stays quiet, if she tries to read the clauses, push the joke narrative harder. Make her feel completely irrational for taking a simple prank seriously. Sloane repeated the lines back, practicing the exact breathy, fake laugh and the precise tilt of her head she would later use on me in the dining room. It was a staged, highly choreographed, psychological production, and I now possessed the director's uncut master copy. When I brought the digital file to Naomi the next morning, she smiled a smile that did not reach her cold eyes. We lock this specific file away in the absolute deepest vault we have, Naomi instructed, tapping a silver pen against her mahogany desk. We absolutely do not release this into the discovery pool right now. We wait for the final deposition. We wait until she has firmly locked herself into a sworn, legally binding narrative under penalty of perjury, when she is too deep to retract her statements. We play this video on a large screen and watch her entire legal defense burn to the ground. The pressure of our counteroffensive quickly triggered a massive structural collapse within Sloane's secret alliances. Sharks only care about blood in the water when it is not their own. Owen Kessler, a man who survived in the ruthless private equity sector by strictly avoiding unnecessary legal exposure, realized the rapidly expanding scope of our civil fraud inquiries. He instantly went into a state of aggressive self-preservation. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with a forged notary stamp or a deeply contested, legally frozen marital asset. To surgically distance himself and his lucrative investment firm from the toxic fallout of Sloane's failing scheme, Kessler's corporate attorneys filed a sworn explanatory declaration directly with the court. In his desperate, frantic attempt to prove he was merely an innocent commercial lender acting in standard good faith, Owen completely immolated his business partner. His signed declaration explicitly confirmed that the entire financial architecture of the design studio's bailout was predicated on a verbal and written guarantee from Sloane. He testified that she had promised to secure absolute control of, or force the immediate liquidation of, my family home within exactly 6 months of the initial divorce filing. He handed us the absolute, undeniable smoking gun regarding her premeditated financial motive, neatly wrapped in a pristine, notarized legal affidavit just to save his own skin. Sloane felt the heavy, inescapable walls closing in around her. The glossy, victimized Instagram narrative she was actively spinning could not pay the commercial warehouse rent, and her ultra-wealthy clients were beginning to loudly notice the frantic, desperate energy surrounding her business operations. The illusion was shattering. She called me late on a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring a glass of cold water. I let the phone ring exactly 4 times before answering, ensuring my device's call recording application was actively engaged and legally compliant. "Harper," she began. Her voice was entirely stripped of the theatrical fragility and the breathy victimhood she had paraded in front of the judge. She sounded thoroughly exhausted, deeply cornered, and incredibly small. "We really need to stop this madness. The mounting legal fees are going to completely destroy both of us. We can handle this quietly. We can handle this privately. I am willing to completely drop the temporary support requests if you just withdraw the civil fraud inquiries and the subpoenas. We can just keep things civil and walk away from each other." It was the ultimate, pathetic confirmation of her absolute defeat. She was no longer fighting for the survival of the marriage, nor was she fighting for the public sympathy narrative. She was desperately fighting to keep herself out of a criminal courtroom. She was trying to frantically negotiate a quiet ceasefire because she had finally realized she brought a cheap plastic knife to a highly coordinated artillery strike. Civil. I repeated the word slowly, letting the heavy, suffocating irony settle over the cellular connection. You actively forged a retired notary stamp to steal my family estate. Sloane. You hired a psychological mercenary to map out my deepest personal insecurities. You drafted an elaborate script to intentionally trigger a massive emotional breakdown in our own dining room so you could steal my house to pay your hidden corporate debts. There is absolutely nothing civil left for us to discuss. Harper, please listen to me. You are going to ruin my entire life over a failed business plan, she pleaded, genuine panic finally breaking through her carefully managed, polished facade. I did not ruin your life, I replied, my voice as cold and fundamentally unyielding as the heavy marble counters in the kitchen where she had first tried to trap me. You built a highly faulty structure on a completely fraudulent foundation. I am simply the compliance officer handing you the final, catastrophic inspection report. If you have anything else to say, speak directly to my attorney. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. The entire dynamic of the power struggle had inverted completely. Sloane had spent 9 long months meticulously planning a hunt, fully believing she was stalking a naive, blindly loyal spouse who would easily surrender to emotional manipulation and gaslighting. She genuinely thought I would simply fold under the overwhelming pressure of a broken heart. Instead, she had violently kicked the cage of a woman who spent 40 to 50 hours every single week systematically identifying exactly where complex corporate systems break down and how to ruthlessly penalize the parties responsible for the failure. She had not initiated a simple, predictable divorce. She had triggered a catastrophic, inescapable audit of her entire existence, and I was going to ensure she paid every single penalty in full. The final climax of our divorce did not happen in a screaming match in a driveway. It happened in the suffocating silence of a mandatory evidentiary hearing just days before the final judicial ruling was scheduled. Sloane sat in the witness chair, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, attempting to project the image of a reasonable woman who had simply made a few administrative errors. She was desperately clinging to the hope that she could still salvage her public image and walk away with a massive financial settlement. Under the heavy weight of a sworn oath, opposing counsel asked her directly about the equity of the Chestnut Hill estate. I never agreed it was her separate property, Sloane stated, her voice smooth and practiced. The paperwork presented at that dinner was just a meaningless draft I found online. It was a foolish prank. It had absolutely no legal weight, and I certainly never intended to forfeit my rightful share of the marital home. Naomi stood up. She did not raise her voice. She walked to the center of the room and handed the judge the original, thick manila envelope and the heavy stack of premium paper from our anniversary dinner. Your Honor, Naomi said, the petitioner just testified that this document was a meaningless, impulsive prank downloaded from the internet. However, we have already submitted the certified digital metadata proving this exact document was meticulously constructed over a period of 3 weeks. It was drafted on a device owned by Mara Voss, but the true intent behind this document is best explained by the petitioner herself. Naomi turned to the court technician. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It was the security footage from our living room, recorded exactly 1 hour before the anniversary dinner. The high-definition video filled the silent courtroom. There was Sloane, pacing across the vintage rug. Then came the crisp, undeniable audio of Mara Voss, directing her over the speakerphone. Force Harper to choose between exploding or signing. Mara's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. We need one of those 2 reactions. If she explodes, we get the abuse narrative. If she signs, we get the cold abandonment narrative. Just slide the paper across the table and wait. Sloane's face completely drained of color. The practiced, calm facade disintegrated instantly. She slumped back in the heavy wooden witness chair as the entire courtroom listened to her rehearse her fake, breathy laugh. Naomi did not let the silence linger. She moved in for the absolute kill. bringing the entire battle back to the very first flaw I had spotted on page 7. Furthermore, Naomi continued, pointing to the original document now resting on the judge's desk. In this highly calculated pre-litigation document, which Mrs. Mercer just admitted on tape was designed specifically to trap her spouse, she explicitly detailed the property division. Page 7 clearly states the home is the sole property of Harper James, allowing only a highly limited, capped reimbursement for aesthetic renovations. She wrote those terms. She signed those terms. She brought them into my client's home to weaponize them. She cannot now demand a 50% equity stake when her own predatory strategy relied on conceding the house entirely. The judge had seen enough. The ruling was a swift, brutal execution of Sloane's entire fabricated life. The judge cited Sloane for severe lack of candor with the court, explicitly noting the hidden bank accounts, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the calculated, malicious psychological tactics used to manipulate the legal process. Sloane lost absolutely every ounce of negotiating leverage. Her demand for $12,000 a month in spousal support was completely denied. The court ruled that the crippling debt associated with Mercer House Atelier, along with the shady private equity funding from Owen Kessler, was entirely her separate, non-marital burden. I was not ordered to pay a single penny toward her failed business. And perhaps the most satisfying victory of all was the formal inclusion of Mara Voss in the permanent public court record. The judge explicitly named Mara as an active participant in an unethical conspiracy to defraud a marital estate. By the end of the business day, that public transcript would begin circulating among the elite legal and mediation circles of Philadelphia, absolutely destroying Mara's lucrative career. I did not deliver a triumphant speech. I did not glare at Sloane as I walked down the center aisle. I simply gathered my coat, shook Naomi's hand, and walked out of the heavy double doors. I walked out with my family home completely secure, my finances untouched, and my marriage legally terminated. The traitor had fallen entirely because the trap she set was simply built too well. But I did not keep the Chestnut Hill brownstone. 6 months after the ink dried on the final divorce decree, I realized I did not want to live inside a massive, echoing tomb of dead memories. The house was a beautiful fortress, but I no longer needed a fortress. I put the property on the market, sold it for a substantial profit to a young surgeon, and used a fraction of the funds to buy a much smaller, modern loft overlooking the Schuylkill River. I recalibrated my entire existence to fit my own proportions, entirely free from the exhausting burden of managing someone else's illusions. On a quiet Friday morning, I sat entirely alone at the sleek granite counter of my new kitchen. The final closing documents for the Chestnut Hill house sale were laid out neatly in front of me. The morning sun reflected off the calm surface of the river outside my window. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the heavy, brass fountain pen. It was the exact same pen I had picked up next to the salt and pepper shakers on that terrible anniversary night. I unscrewed the cap, pressed the sharp metal nib to the crisp white paper, and signed my name. As the dark ink settled into the page, I smiled. It was not a smile of bitter revenge or lingering anger. It was the quiet, profound peace of knowing that, for the first time in over a decade, absolutely no one else held the pen to my life. No one else would ever write my reactions again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.